So how's the volume? Is it good? All right, great. So I'm Joan Barano, and I welcome you all to Dominican. I direct the Masters in Humanities in the MFA program in Creative Writing, and we're really honored to be able to host this event. And I'm going to turn it over to Meryl Natchez, to get us started.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I want to just give a huge thank you to Joan Barano and Dominican University, who just jumped on the last-minute plan changes to be able to accommodate all of us. It was just so gracious and so wonderful. And also, I'd like to introduce Linda's twin sister, Louise. Do you want to stand up for a minute, Louise? Who was really helpful getting you all here, because I don't know you. So it's thanks to her and to Robert Haas that this event is happening. And a huge thank you to the board of MPC, Marin Poetry Center, which came up with a budget for this event with no restrictions, so that we could have a wonderful event for you. And especially to the staff, our volunteers from MPC, Sean Killingsworth, Rebecca Faust, Paula Weinberger, Margaret Stawawi, Erin Radini, and Maxine Fleischer-Duzguns, and even Susan Cohen, who schlepped 1 million packages from Falkirk in the middle of the night with me without hardly a complaint. Also, Grey Wolf, the publisher, Grey Wolf Press, the publisher of Linda's selected poems, has donated 20 copies of that volume. And, oh, well, they're gone. So I was going to tell you were on a first-come, first-served basis, but I guess they've been served. But also, Kit and Run Press and Literal Press got together and did a broadside as a takeaway from the event. So please only take one of those. If you've already got one, don't take another. There's a couple of seats up here if you're looking for seats. For tonight, I'm expecting this event to stay within an hour and a half. We have a lot of people who wanted to speak, and I'm pretty much limiting it to friends and family and colleagues and students, because just so many people love Linda's work and wanted to read a poem. And if you asked to read and didn't, I'm really sorry. But there's only so much time, and we'll have plenty of time afterwards to eat and drink and talk and recite poetry. So there are going to be about 12 readers, and they're each going to take 3 to 5 minutes. I have a little red card I'm going to hold up if I think it's going a little too long, because we don't want it to go too long. We want to have some time to just talk about Linda among ourselves. And I've asked Robert Haas to speak first, because this event was his idea. So I turn it over to you. Poet, colleague, and friend.
Thank you, Meryl. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, all the staff of the Poetry Center. This is great. It's pretty much exactly what I think Linda would have wanted. I reached in to look at the first book of her poems, remembering the phrasing of the poem. So she was born in New York, grew up in Forest Knolls, went to Drake High, where she was first encouraged in poetry as a 15, 16-year-old girl by a wonderful English teacher who I think was also the basketball coach at Drake, Kathy Laffin. And she went from there to San Francisco State, and at the age of 19, sat in the back of the classroom of a dashing poet who had just had his first book published in the Yale series. It was 1962. Jack Gilbert was 37 or 38 years old. Linda was 19. That relationship lasted the rest of their lives. As a marriage, it lasted. They left for Greece, Santorini, sometime in London, sometime in Denmark. the marriage or the partnership came apart, and in roughly 1971, Linda came back to San Francisco and went to San Francisco State and got her master's degree. The next year, I was invited to join a group that met on Telegraph Hill on Monday nights to read Ezra Pound's cantos. Peter Weltner from San Francisco State and Bill Chaplin from San Francisco State were part of the group. We read through over 2 years, read through the cantos and then read through Shakespeare's romances at the end of that period. Linda had not yet published a poem. And she, after a while in San Francisco, left to went to New York. Her time in New York led her to New England. Her time in New England led her to marriage to John Brentlinger, who was a Plato scholar and also an activist who was very involved with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, which took Linda to Nicaragua. That marriage ended in 1990. Began a period for, by then she had published these books, but let me go back to Linda at 37, because she was in New York State, she was writing these poems, and she had a summer job picking apples in a New England apple orchard, and wrote a poem that is called "What If the World Always Stays Far Off?" What if the world is taken from me, if there is no recognition, my words unheard? Keats wanted to write great poetry, and I'm in the middle of an orchard all day. So I won't read the whole poem, What If the World is Taken from Me? So this is a matter of hearing her words tonight, her astonishing words. So she was 31, I guess, when I met her. I had no idea what her poems were like. I said, be curious to see some of your poems. She gave me some poems. First poem I looked at went, what things are steadfast? Not the birds, not the bride and the groom who hurry in their brevity to touch one another. The stars do not blow away as we do. The heavenly things ignite and freeze, but not as my hair falling before you. Fragile and momentary we continue, fearing madness in all things huge and its requiring, managing as thin light on water, managing only greetings and farewells. We love a little, as the mice huddle, as the goat leans against my hand, as the lovers quickening, riding time, making safety in the moment. This touching home goes far, this fishing in the air. I thought, my God! The next poem that I read was called The Girl I Call Alma. And it began, the girl I call Alma, who is so white, is good, isn't she? Even though she does not speak, you can tell by her distress that she is just like the beach and the sea, isn't she? And she is disappearing, isn't that good? And the white curtains and the secret smile are just her way with the lies, aren't they? And that we are not alone ever, and that everything is backwards otherwise. And that inside the no is the yes, isn't it? Isn't it? And that she is the God who perishes, the food we eat, the body we fuck, the loose net we throw out that gathers her. Fish, fish, white sun. Tell me we are one, and it is the others who scar me, not you. Anyway, it was astonishing, just right. These are the first two poems I looked at with no particular in mind. So, at age 38, Michael Cudahy, who spent time in the summer in Woodacre and edited Ironwood, which was one of the most exciting literary magazines of the 80s. And every other issue, he did an issue on some major poet, Thomas Tranströmer or Milosz, and when I asked him what he was going to do next, he said, Linda Gregg. So when she was 39 years old, this issue of the magazine everybody wanted to be in, Ironwood, was half new translations of the poems of the great Peruvian poet Cesar Vallejo, and the other half, Linda Gregg, an introduction, which began with a poem that begins, "What things are steadfast? Not the birds, not the pride of the group, who together." And then the next year came Too Bright to See. And then a few years later, Alma, which is the book of her, Too Bright to See is a lot the book of her time with Jack in Greece. Alma is a book of her finding her legs as a poet, as herself. Those are the two books of the 80s. Alma was published in 1985. 95, then came The Sacrament of Desire, then Chosen by the Lion, and then Things in the Flesh. Those are the three books of the 90s. And that belongs mostly to the period of her time in New England and a period of about the intensity of desire in relationships that happened when she had a period of being kind of itinerant teacher poet. Third book, then the fourth and fifth book, Chosen by the Lion, Things in Flesh, work that out, that's the 90s. And then in the 2000s came In the Middle Distance. You can feel the desire to back off from being chosen by a lion to being in the middle distance. And then the selected poems, which had a whole section of new poems, a new book called All of It Singing. I hope we'll get some of the shape of this astonishing body of work from. Do you want me to?
No, that's okay. I'm doing the introductions.
Okay.
I think it's wonderful to clap for Bob, but if we clap for everybody, it's going to be a lot longer evening. So let's just sort of move from one to the next. And the next person is David Semanki, a close friend and former student of Linda. And one thing I've learned through this month and a half process of putting this together is Linda had an incredible influence on her students. And several of them have flown here from far away to be here for this event. So David.
Good evening. I think Linda would be very humbled, by so many people attending this event. So I came to know Linda first as a student in a series of Sunday workshops at the 92nd Street Y in New York, and then as a graduate student at Columbia University. She was utterly generous and a supportive teacher who took each student's work seriously, no matter how bad one's poem happened to be on the day. In time, Linda became a poetry mentor to me, and over the years we became very dear friends. We regularly spoke several times a week, and those of you who knew Linda knew those conversations could turn into marathon conversations. She adored talking on the telephone. Our chats would range from books to the latest Anthony Bourdain episode to a new set of towels from Koyuchi and Point Reyes Station. She liked a very specific size that they made because she found it perfect to wrap up her her wet hair after washing it. To memories of Linda's childhood growing up as a twin in rural Forest Knolls and visiting her much adored maternal grandparents in the big city of Petaluma. To Linda's own poetry teachers and mentors like Robert Duncan and George Oppen, and of course Jack Gilbert. To those miraculous years Linda lived daily alongside the sacred on the Greek islands, where she honed her craft and philosophy as a poet. Linda was unique. Linda's poetry remains unique. More than any other poet that I have known, Linda embodied a purity of dedication and belief in the gifts and depths a poem can offer. I would like to read a poem Linda wrote early in her life. It's during her undergraduate days at San Francisco State. I came across it while sorting through some of her papers. The last couple of years I was helping her do that. And the poem dates no later than the mid-1960s. And it appears to be untitled, and it is a brief little poem, but it is divided into two sections. 1. When I was 11, I found a private river moving through the horse's skull. I carried that thing down the mountain, watching my small shadow far away on the other hill. I buried it below my home, in the woods, under the horrible violet myrtle, near my father's creek. 2. Where I was afraid of something. There are rivers like doves, wonderful, and your mouth tells me, your mouth, how difficult to drink only through the holes in that skull. Forever I will feel the foliage move above me, will lie near the wet roots and stems, humming on the water. My song. Thank you.
So Judith Brown is a childhood friend of Linda, and her husband Dwight is going to read a poem for her.
Oh, I guess she's going to read it herself.
No, I'm not going to read it, but I just want to say a little something. Because I kept thinking, what is it about Linda? She absolutely was like unique. And I just want to hear what everybody else says, because is my oldest. Linda and Louise, we were like a trio, you know, because I grew up in the Philippines, but then was sent to camp when we moved here. So you bond often, I've heard, with the first people you meet in another country. And so it was, in fact, the poem Dwight's going to read, it's that one, Fishing in the Keep of Silence, where the hills rise up. And we're staying with my sister right now, and the hills do rise up. You know what I mean? It's really, and also the part about Linda being a great teacher, because my sister taught, went to the camp too, and she then later was a counselor, and she was telling me that Linda would teach the kids poetry. And she remembered a line, and the line was, I love this, the tree cast a shadow of flowers. And that's even like, that a child would say, she had the gift to draw out, because she's the one that inspired me to want to be an artist, was Linda, you know, and it was something about my sister said, be short for you, you know. So the first thing was that I always loved, because I'd phone up Linda too, the same thing as I haven't seen her our last visit was to New York, but it was mostly talking on the phone. And when she'd talk, it would be like a poem. You know, she'd describe riding down a bicycle down someplace, and how she described it was a poem. You know, it was just, and she said the poetry wasn't, she didn't really know words, but that's why I want to hear more, remember more. You know, we've got to remember more, because she was unique, and there was a treasure And when we were little, we would go visit I'd go to visit in the weekend, and their home, I love their home, like when you talk about that river, they took such good care of it. On every Saturday they'd clean, and it was in such beautiful order. And the way Linda, I know she taught her students, was to observe 6 concrete details. So I thought, okay, I'll try to remember 6 concrete details about Linda. And one of them was Casey was a poet that Linda knew when she was in high school, I think, I forget when. And he said, letters first, poems later. And so that always impacted me. I thought, I don't have a good letter writer, but I paint on the envelopes. It was like the importance of the communication, somehow I love that. That totally impacted me, because I'm thinking, what impacted me about Linda? Dwight saying, and so, concrete details, letters first. Oh, and she was always asking me, what's blooming? What's blooming where we lived? And so that's what I'm going to miss, is the conversations. And I'll say, well, the cherries are almost right on the trees now, they're almost ripe. And then we just went to visit our youngest son in Okinawa, and the Easter lilies were blooming all over, and they grow wild there, and that's where they came from. But she would do absolute, concrete, see the beauty, it was beauty. It's like, okay, so Dwight will read. Let me think of, we'll talk, anyway. Well, let's write down the details, 6 concrete details of Linda. Anyone's more stuff. She was an incredible, loyal friend. I'll sit down. This is my favorite. We read this poem.
Stand here while I read.
Okay,
I'm reading this for Judith.
because he's a good reader.
Fishing in the Keep of Silence. There is a hush now while the hills rise up and God is going to sleep. He trusts the ship of heaven to take over and proceed beautifully as he lies dreaming in the lap of the world. He knows the owls will guard the sweetness of the soul in their massive keep of silence, looking out with eyes open or closed over the length of Tamales Bay that the egrets conform to, whitely broad in flight, white and slim in standing. God, who thinks about poetry all the time, breathes happily as he repeats to himself, there are fish in the net, lots of fish this time, in the net of the heart.
Thank you.
So Jim and Sue Finnegan came here from Connecticut for this, and Jim's going to, a longtime friend of Linda's, going to be called.
I'm also going to tell a little stories, a couple little ones. I was involved first with Linda in 1985 when she was living in Northampton, Massachusetts, and my wife Susan and I moved there. And I was standing in the post office, and I looked down and I see, well, there was a woman there, and she had an envelope. It was addressed to the American Poetry Review, so I said, "Are you a poet?" And I was a part-time poet at that time, and so we struck up a conversation there in the Northampton post office. I didn't see her for a whole year, but we had talked about maybe forming a group in Northampton, and so about a year later, I did see her again in the post office, and we struck up a conversation again. And she said, "My friend Jack Gilbert's coming to town. Let's start the group this week." So that was, done deal. We'll get the group together. And there was a marvelous time there in Northampton with the group that became known as Group 18, because our first meeting was at Linda's apartment on Valley Street. One of the images I want to leave you with about Linda in the world was she would ride around Northampton with a blue Raleigh bicycle with a basket mounted on top of it, wearing a dress, her hair flowing, doing errands. She would also walk through the fields behind her Valley Street apartment all the way to the Connecticut River and swim in the Connecticut River. She was one of the first kind of pure artists in the world that just lived her life and wrote her poetry, and it was very impressive to me. And she got very close to our family, Susan, and our children, particularly my daughter, Linda. And then later on, we would go to New York City, and we'd always get her out to go to museums and things like that, and the Met and MoMA and such. In fact, the last conversation I had with her, we tried to get her out like 6 months ago to a show at the Met, but she wasn't up to it. And it was a show called Poetry in Nature, and about the Edo period of Japan. And so anyway, that leads me into the poem I'm going to read, because it has some of the wabi-sabi in it. And this comes from her last book. I'll have to grab some specs though. Pardon me. Not her last book. This comes from Middle Distance, excuse me. It's called Elegance. And it probably is, well, it definitely is a Marfa poem. Elegance. All that is uncared for, left alone in the stillness, in that pure silence, married to the stillness of nature. A door off its hinges, shade and shadows in an empty room, leaks for light, raw where the tin roof rusted through, the rustle of weeds in their different kinds of air in the mornings, year after year. A pecan tree and the house made out of mud bricks, accurate and unexpected beauty, rattling and singing. If not the sun, if not to the sun, then to nothing, or to no and to no one.
Thank you, Jim.
And Brenda, you're next. Brenda Hillman, friend and poet.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks, Meryl and Joe and everyone. So I didn't know Linda very well. I knew her a little bit. I knew her work very well, and I knew her work through Bob. When I first read Too Bright to See, I was a young mother, frazzled, raising other people's children and my own, and really distraught a lot of the time. And I thought of Linda Gregg as a luminous being with this sort of artist's purity off someplace else, and writing luminous poems. And so she still, to me, represents this sort of clarity, amazing purity and clarity of the artist's life. And I know she went through a lot of other things in her life, but that is an image I have of her. The second image is that I belong to a women's reading group. We call it a coven. We meet in a bar. And we, once in a while, we have been reading mostly new books by women, but the next book we're reading, before Linda's passing, we had decided to read Too Bright to See, because I think we have to sort of rescue great classics over and over. And this is a great classic, Too Bright to See. And these books should not be allowed to pass into any kind of oblivion. They need to be continually rescued. And the third thing is that I was on a committee that gave the Jackson Prize, and I think we all agreed there was no contest about giving Linda this prize, and we thought that her work had a kind of not just permanence, but a kind of a pact with the spirit and matter that nobody else had come up with in this particular way. So I'm going to read a poem from Too Bright to See. It's a poem about relationship. It's not a glad poem, but it's a great poem. The Defeated. I sat at the desk for a while, fooling with my hair and looking at the blackbirds on the bakery roof. Pulled the curtain, put my hair back, and said, "It's time to start." Now it's after 3. You are still on the bus, I guess, looking out the window, sleeping, knowing your defeat, and eating lunch part by part so it will last the whole journey. I heard there are women who light candles and put them in the sand, wade out in dresses carrying flowers. Here we have no hope. The pregnant woman has the abortion and then refuses to speak. Horses stall in their strength, whitening patches of air with their breath. There will be this going on without them. Dogs bark, or 5 birds fly straight up to a branch out of reach. I had warm pumpernickel bread, cheese, and chicken. It is sunny outside. I miss you. My head is tired. John was nice this morning. Already what I remember most is the happiness of seeing you, having tea, falling asleep, waking up with you there awake in the kitchen. It was like being alive twice. I'll try to tell you better when I am stronger. What does the moth think when the skin begins to split? Is the air an astonishing pain? I keep seeing the arms bent, the legs smashed up against the breasts with her sex showing, the weak hands clenched. I see the sad, unused face. Then she starts to stand up in the opening out. I know ground and trees. I know air. But then everything else stops because I don't know what happens after that.
I don't know either. Larry Felsen is a longtime friend and was part of Jack Gilbert's group here in the Bay Area that had a sort of local fame, and he's going to read the poem next. Also, he's videotaping this event, so.
I'm not doing it personally at the moment. My wife is actually doing it. I have known Linda, for so many years back into the 60s. And I knew Linda, and Jack, kind of as friends, I would say first. I was a young poet and I got to know them. And so it's hard. It's hard not to go to the past tense. Stay in the present. She was such a huge part of our lives, and Jack as well, back then, and has continued to be so for me and many others. And it's very hard to separate the poetry from the person, because she, as people have been spoken to, she lived and breathed her poetry. In terms of contradictions and all the messiness of her, many things that happened to her as well as happened to all of us, but she was able to somehow to connect with those things and make them live, for us. At any rate, I'm going to read a few things. I'm going to read a poem by one or two other people who couldn't be here tonight. But I'm also going to first start out by reading a statement from Barry Tagrin. And Barry has a study abroad program in Paros, Greece. And Linda was there for a while, as was Jack. And she gave a reading there, and she sort of, her memory is, she remembered very well there. And the students had talked about her, and Barry wrote a statement about it. I will miss Linda's depth of emotion and intelligence and remember her daily, as her work and her life introduced me to the world of poetry and humanistic values. She was the first grown woman I met and didn't know until that day such persons of female range existed. I bought into her devotion to Jack, the mythology and personas of her poetic voice, and her dilemma too in maintaining a marriage of such opposite-mannered human beings. This is Barry. Brave, Tough if need be, and packed with a glorious softness, she taught me how to face the complexity of love and the value of lifelong partnerships, no matter how the rain falls. That's buried. Then I'm going to read a poem of a longtime friend of hers named Donna Brees, who is now living in Greece and had a long relationship with Jack and Linda, and he now lives on a hillside in Greece, in Paros. This is a poem that Linda wrote, and Donald says the poem is written at a 5-minute walk from the hillside where Donald now lives in Greece. It's called Glistening, and it's from the Sacraments of Desire. As I pull the bucket from the crude well, the water changes from dark to a light more silver than the sun. When I put it over my body, that is standing in the dust by the oleander bush, it sparkles easily in the sunlight with an earnestness like the spirit close up. The water magnifies the sun all along the length of it. Love is not less because of the spirit. Delight does not make the heart childish. We thought the blood thinned, our weight lessened, that our substance was reduced by simple happiness. The oleander is thick with leaves and flowers because of spilled water. Let the spirit marry the heart. When I returned naked to the stone porch, there was no one to see me glistening. But I look at the almond tree with its husks cracking open in the heat. I look down the whole mountain to the sea, goats bleating faintly and sometimes bells. I stand there a long time with the sun and the quiet, the earth moving slowly as I dry in the light. And then I'll just read one more. I mean, I wasn't going to, I'm just going to read, I wrote something about my feelings for Linda, and I'm just going to read it. It's dearest friend and confidant, siren, muse, Bessie Smith, reborn, advice columnist, untamed heart, fierce interrogator, sympathetic psychiatrist, dream merchant, myth maker, goddess of eros and chaos and everyday reality, midnight traveler, excavator of the deep and dark, Eurydice in the flesh, Orpheus, arouser, spirit lifter, love maker, bringer of light. So I'm just going to read one more poem. And it's from Sacraments of Desire. It's Ordinary Songs. Dull with pneumonia, wrapped on the porch, I watch the wind darken parts of the smooth sea again and again. Watch the sheen return each time a lighter color. The Greek woman sings as if the sky were listening. Ordinary songs. About a man gone long enough for her to know he's gone always. Songs like that. Sings easily and loud over the quiet water to where the sky disappears. Sheep eating and bells ringing. I think of the roofs in Massachusetts with the gray sky above and the blind man walking in the snow as the train shook everything passing near us. I think of us all wanting the gods to touch our skin. Our hearts blessing the slender, bare trees in American lots of bearded, dry weeds. I have come here for the trial by grace, by loneliness, remembering the girl I started as trying to know the earth with her body, the touch of the bark all she had, trying to find her way to the love women know. I had brought myself to these hot fields of dark red poppies and the quiet cove over there, shepherds and fishermen and the happy women in black who give me milk and fish while everything blooms and I accept gratefully. Listening to doves, I grow sleepy and dream of a still world where space looks like the sound owls make at night. A world without color that knows the sea's dark blue. Without people, but knows the dancer and marble form. Without light, but knows the fire it came from. I sleep as a shard weary from earthquakes moving earth an inch at a time, tilting each thing. The sea wearing the land, everything stronger than me. On the shard, a reclining naked woman kissed by a god.
Thanks, Larry.
So Sharif Shanahan was a student of Linda's and now is a poet and teaches at Stanford.
Thank you so much, Meryl, for including me and Tim. I'm really grateful to have the chance to share a little bit about Linda and to read a poem or a little bit about my experience with Linda. I met her as a sophomore at Princeton, and I had just begun to develop an interest in poetry, and I applied for a poetry workshop and was placed in Linda's section and went that first week to class. And found Linda so eccentric that I didn't know what to do with my discomfort. She vibrated. I mean, I was a child and I had never met anyone like her, and she vibrated at a frequency that I had not yet encountered in my life. I tried to leave the section. I tried to get out of the dissection, and I went to James Richardson's section the next week, and I brought my 10 poems, and I said, I really would like to be in this section. Can I please be in this section? And he said, I'm very sorry to tell you that if you want to take the class, you're going to have to stay in the section that you're in. And so I went to the Princeton bookstore, and I went to the poetry shelf, because we never got more than a shelf, and I just opened up one of Linda's books at random, and it was Chosen by the Lion, and it was the first poem of hers that I was reading, of course, and I'll share it. It's called Asking for Directions. And after I finished reading this poem, all hyperbole aside, I was changed, and I knew that I needed more of whatever it was that I just encountered on that page, and so I went back to Linda the next week and for years afterwards, and spent what feels like years and was in fact years reading her poems to anyone who would listen, and trying to learn whatever I could from her when she gave me the time to do so. So this was the poem that I read that afternoon more than 15 years ago now. It's called Asking for Directions. We could have been mistaken for a married couple, riding on the train from Manhattan to Chicago that last time we were together. I remember looking out the window and praising the beauty of the ordinary, the in-between places, the world with its back turned to us, the small neglected stations of our history. I slept across your chest and stomach without asking permission because they were the last hours. There was a smell to the sheepskin lining of your new Chinese vest that I didn't recognize. I felt it deliberately. I woke early and asked you to come with me for coffee. You said sleep more, and I said we only had 1 hour, and you came. We didn't say much after that. In the station, you took your things and handed me the vest, then left as we had planned. So you would have 10 minutes to meet your family and leave. I stood by the seat, dazed by exhaustion and the absoluteness of the end. So still, I was aware of myself breathing. I put on the vest and my coat, got my bag, and turning, saw you through the dirty window, standing outside, looking up at me. We looked at each other without any expression at all. Invisible, unnoticed, still. That moment is what I will tell of as proof that you loved me permanently. After that, I was a woman alone, carrying her bag, asking a worker which direction to walk to find a taxi.
So I realize you people don't have the list of who's reading, and so that might produce a little anxiety, but we're more than halfway done. I'm sorry you don't have a list, but it just kept changing right up until 5 minutes ago, so that's why you don't. But Forrest Gander is going to read next, also a poet and friend of Linda's.
In 1980 and 1981, in the summer times, I worked for the editor that Bob mentioned a while ago, Michael Cuddy, editor of Ironwood magazine here in Woodacre, California. And it was Michael that turned me on to Linda's work for the first time. I met her in the mid-'80s, finally on the East Coast. She was a fan of Frank Stanford's, and that and my interest in her work drew us together. In the 1990s, I saw Jack Gilbert more often than Linda, but Linda and I corresponded. I guess that's when I also came to know Jim and Susan Finnegan, who also shared a love for Linda's work. I would visit Linda in New York when I was going down there in the year 2000 to take care of Aga Shahid Ali in his last year while he was dying. I was there a lot. In Marfa in 2006, I hid a poem for Linda in a slot in a beam of the ruined house that she'd bought in Marfa to fix up. I don't think she ever did have the money to fix that house up. It's a beautiful romantic dream. She stayed with CD and me in Providence occasionally. I remember her talking about her sister, hi Louise, who I met in Marfa, and California, and I remember a particular story she told about domestic dogs running down deer on like the family's property and slaughtering them. I remember surprising Linda in New York while she was going through cancer treatments. She'd just come back to her rent-controlled apartment from the hospital when I knocked, but she opened the door. She was thin and ill and exhausted, alone in her apartment, which was very spare, with no one to cook her a meal or make her tea. She didn't complain. She was happy for the company. Little poem from the middle distance. Marfa poem. Highway 90. An owl lands on the side of the road, turns its head to look at me going fast, window open to the night, on the desert, clean air, and the great stars. I'm trying to decide if this is what I want.
So Sean Killingsworth is going to read a poem. She's the only person on the list who's not a friend or family, but she devoted 2 days of her life to getting the food together for this event. So I felt she deserved a slot on the program.
So, as Meryl said, I didn't know Linda, but I have come to know her through her work. And listening to everybody read her work today with everyone's different voices and different intonations and different accents really underlines what I like the most about her poems, which is that when you look at the poem on the page, you can see the work of her mind almost as though she's turning one idea over and then looking at the next natural sequential idea over and over, each line, each phrase, each image. And so the poem that I chose to read of hers, I think I like it because it speaks to me just on a personal level, but I think it also really illustrates this idea of the sequential progression of thought. Now I understand. Something was pouring out, filling the field and making it vacant. A wind blowing them sideways as they moved forward. The crying as before. Suddenly I understood why they left the empty bowls on the table in the empty hut overlooking the sea, and knew the meaning of the heron breaking branches, spreading his wings in order to rise up out of the dark woods into the night sky. I understood about the lovers and the river in January. I heard the crying out as a battlement of greatness, and then the dying began, the height of passion. saw the breaking of the moon and the shattering of the sun, believed in the miracle because of the half heard and the other half seen. How they ranged and how they fed, let loose their cries. One could call it the agony in the garden or the paradise, depending on whether the joy was at the beginning or after.
So Kevin Weiner came here early and also helped get everything together. Just was wonderful. He's also a student of Linda's and he teaches at Berkeley. Kevin.
Just a little correction, it's Weiner.
Sorry.
Rhymes with Weiner, Finer, and Diner. Yeah, I get that a lot, don't worry. I have a ton of Weiner jokes for my students. So I studied with Linda for 3 years at Princeton. And one of my favorite things as a student, and something that I'll always remember, is the way that she would touch her fingertips together to describe the way that words have texture. And it's an image that's stayed burned in my brain, hopefully forever. And speaking of brains, I'm a brain scientist at Berkeley at Cal. Of course, I still write poetry. And when people come into my office, they get very confused because my bookshelf has more poetry books than neuroscience books. And they ask me, are you a neuroanatomist or are you a poet? And my answer always is, Linda Gregg said I could be both. And specifically, she I don't know if you use this, but she taught us from a book of luminous things. And so I thought it was appropriate to read one of her two contributions. This one is from Alma, and it's called Adult. I've come back to the country where I was happy, changed. Passion puts no terrible strain on me now. I wonder what will take the place of desire. I could be the ghost of my own life, returning to the places I lived best. Walking here and there, nodding when I see something I cared for deeply. Now I'm in my house, listening to the owls calling, and wondering if slowly I will take on flesh again. Well, Linda, all of us here know that wherever your house is now, you're still wondering and wandering, and of course, enjoying every thought, step, and observation. Thanks.
John Hart, are you here? John Hart is a family friend. Oh, Nona, I forgot you. I'm so sorry. I thought you'd left.
No, that's right. I'm not a poet, but you're going to hear from one in just a moment. I'm Nona Dennis, and I am a past president of Marin Conservation League. And you may ask, what's the connection between Linda Gregg and the Marin Conservation League? I didn't know Linda. I've known Louise, and we worked together on various environmental causes that involve particularly West Marin. But when I read, I knew about Linda, and when I read the obituary in the New York Times several months ago, I thought, why is this such a familiar, what is the resonance here? And it brought back, the Gregg name brought back a resonance of a family that not only was shaped by Marin, but helped to shape Marin. Harold Gregg, her father, was actually the first designated executive director of the Marin Conservation League, and that was after the league had been around for 35 years. This year we're celebrating our 85th year, and some 50 years ago, Harold Gregg helped to shape, as John will tell you, some of the most incredible years in Marin County's conservation history. Amazing things happened, and Harold Gregg was the one who really led the league at that time. It's easy for us to go back after 85 years, and look at the 4 women who founded Marin, Carolyn Livermore and others. And it's easy to forget that in the middle, in some of the most formative years of the League, was someone named Harold Gregg, who had lived this amazing life. And I'm going to turn it over to John, who's both poet and nature writer, to tell you about that.
There's much to tell, and I'll try not to tell much. But Linda was part of a remarkable family, which I've known several portions of and several aspects of over the years, although unfortunately I never met Linda. But Harold, who was born in 1906 in Petaluma, studied, as I understand it, art education back east and was making quite a mark in that field. He was also an architect. But he began his family there, or I guess all the daughters were born there. Came back to Marin and wound up working for Mary Summers, a pioneering early Marin conservationist in the new Marin County Planning Department. And across his desk came a piece of paper regarding the impending tax sale of the Taylor property on Lagunitas Creek. He and others with the Conservation League at the time stepped in and lobbied and got that piece of property taken as what became Samuel P. Taylor State Park, a vital step in the preservation of western Marin County. There was money to buy the land, there was no money to staff it. And he, according to the story I have heard, went home to his family, which was then living in Sebastopol, and said to his wife, Frances, would you like to go camping? And the whole family packed up and spent a number of months, the sisters disagree how many months and what weather, under the redwoods in the future Samuel Taylor State Park, guarding the place. As a result of contacts made in that era, he and Frances founded the Forest Farms Youth Camp in the San Geronimo Valley, which was the first east of the Mississippi, which was coeducational, multiracial, and multinational, and got some skeptical attention from the authorities as a result. And that continued for more than a decade. At the end of that period, Harold, as Nona said, was the face of the Marin Conservation League during a revolutionary period in Marin County planning, which really established the basic structure of Marin County land use that we know today. So, and there's much more to say, but I think the love of nature and the precise observation and the artistic sensibility that pervades Linda's work is really best understood as part of this family fabric and the fabric of this place that she loved so much, and where Jack Gilbert broke his back in a tree trimming accident. I was going to read her poem dedicated to Harold, Skylord. It's a little long, and I think I'll pick a shorter one, which I also love. It's the title poem of her first volume, Too Bright to See. Just before dark, the light gets dark. Violet, where my hands pull weeds around the Solomon seals. I see with difficulty what before was easy. Perceive what I saw before, but with more tight effort. I am moon to what I am doing and what I was. It is a real beauty that I lived and dreamed would be, now know, but never then. Can tell by looking hard, feeling which is weed and what is form. My hands are intermediary, neither lover nor liar. Sweet being, if you are anywhere that hears, come quickly. I weep, face set, no tears, mouth open.
So now I'm worried that I forgot somebody else. So I'm just gonna say, I think next is Jane Hirschfield, and then Timothy Luger, and then Susan Finnegan, and then we're gonna hear Linda's voice reading a poem to her sister. Is there anybody I've forgotten, because somebody took my copy of the program with the last minute notes? Okay, then I think Giovanni, we probably have time for you to read a poem if you're still here and want to read. Come. This is Giovanni Singleton, a lover of Linda's work, who requested to read a poem, and I didn't think there was time, but we're doing great on time, so why not?
Thank you, Meryl. Thank you all. It's interesting. I had asked to read a poem, but the poem I want to read has already been read. But I will add a little bit of commentary in that this poem, Elegance, was written while Linda was remembering a visit she made to a nearby dead town in West Texas. And the poem spoke to me for a couple of reasons.